Hi, I'm Seth, creator of Palookaville Comics, and you're listening to the True North Country Comics Podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics Podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book and graphic novel creators and supporters. I'm John Swinimer. If you want to drop me a line, you can contact me at john@truenorthcountrycomics.com. On this episode, I chat with Seth about Palookaville 24 and more. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts and YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel. And if you want to help the site and the podcast, please consider supporting the effort by chipping in at ko-fi.com/truenorthcountrycomics. Your patronage is greatly appreciated. Seth is a cartoonist, designer, and collector residing in Guelph, Ontario. His books include Wimbledon Green, George Sprott, and Clyde Fans. He's the subject of the award-winning National Film Board documentary Seth's Dominion, and was a winner in 2011 of the prestigious Harbourfront Prize. After 20 years of serialization, Clyde Fans was published in 2019 and went on to be the first graphic novel ever nominated for the Giller Prize. In 2021, his bronze sculpture arrangement Living Room Suite was installed in front of the Art Gallery of Guelph. In 2022, Seth was honored by the French government as a Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres. His latest book is called Palookaville 24, published by Drawn Quaterly. Palookaville 24 begins with Seth's serialized adolescent autobiography, Nothing Lasts, as a memoir ruminating on memory and place and the people who passed through his young life. The Apology of Albert Batch is an essay about a short film that captures the culmination of 10 years of collaboration with director Luc Chamberlain, documenting Seth's journey into puppetry. And lastly, drawn loosely with poster paint and ink, Seth offers 5 stories based on a spontaneous sketchbook activity showing a different side of the master artist. And so, without further ado, here's my chat with Seth about Palookaville 24 and more. So Seth, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
My pleasure.
I appreciate your time. Before I get going with all the questions, I would like to know, what was the first comic book that you read?
You know, that's the kind of thing that should be a clear, perfect answer, but it's a little foggy in the kind of mess of early childhood. I'm not sure the very first. I mean, I probably read a couple of Archies or some Harvey comics or something, but the very first comic I have a really clear memory of is an X-Men comic from about 1971, I think. It was X-Men 67. It was a reprint of the X-Men, where it's an early issue of Fighting Magneto, a double-sized issue, and I found it at a Cub camp I was at. It was in a big box of comics, and I read it. I remember being very excited by it because I remembered it well enough that a few years later, I came across it again somewhere else and bought it. This would be when I was really young, because, I mean, I was still not reading comics after that, like fully. Say that was like, I was probably in like grade 2 when I came across that. And then I started to really read comics in about grade 7 or 8. Yeah, grade 8 for sure.
Cool. I was reading that in your youth, as part of practicing your illustration skills, you created something called Cosmic Comics. Wondering, do you think that artwork will ever see the light of day?
Not if I have anything to say about it.
Okay.
I mean, I have a great fondness and affection for that comic book art I made as a kid and a teenager, a little less for the teenage stuff, but I would certainly not show it or publish it because it's very, very earnest and embarrassing, to be honest. I mean, I'm proud of the effort I put in. I drew hundreds and hundreds of pages as a kid. And I think a lot of my adult life here in my studio is an attempt to recreate that experience. That work I did back then was part of, like, I think of as the essential training period that made me into a cartoonist. I didn't sit down and study like as a kid saying like, oh, I want to be a cartoonist. I'm going to like learn my skills. It's exactly the opposite. It was done purely for pleasure. I loved comic books and I wanted to make my own comic books, which were mostly just imitations of the comics I was reading. And I just poured that stuff out onto the page every day, working with an enthusiasm that had nothing to do with the idea of work. So now when I sit down in the studio, it's very hard to do that same thing. I mean, I'm 60 years old now. I'm working every day, but I try to capture some of that feeling of trying to lose myself into the work. That work, I look at it, I've had much of it bound into books. I still feel a kind of a sweet pleasure when I look at it, a nostalgia. But if I actually sit and try and read like one of those old comics, it's very embarrassing. They're earnest in a way that it makes you kind of cringe. Beyond the outright stealing that I was doing of like any story I just read, I would just regurgitate it out and with slight changes. The real embarrassing part is that it's filled with kind of like the yearnings of a pre-adolescent. And so I can tell you, I don't sit down and read that stuff for pleasure.
Right. Well, let's talk about your work today. I'm wondering who or what inspires you to create today?
Yeah, it's funny. So much changes as an artist as you get old. I don't read comics in the way I used to read them. I don't read I probably am a bit out of touch now. I still, of course, love the cartoonists I always loved. And I would say that one of my favorite cartoonists is the New York cartoonist Ben Catcher. I pull his works off the shelf and reread them all the time. I love Chris Ware. I love Chester Brown, Robert Crumb, all these people. But I'm not sure that that's my main inspiration anymore. I feel like a tremendous amount of what I'm looking at now is more in the world of painters, and I read a lot of fiction. I feel like I probably am not taking as direct influence from cartooning and comic books as I did when I was younger. I mean, when I was in my 20s and my 30s, even my 40s, there was nothing I was more inspired by than comics. I was, obsessively interested in the past of cartooning, tracking down the work of cartoonists in the 20s to the 60s. Collecting was such an important part of my of just everything I did. But I think maybe in some level, I've kind of burnt out on that. I don't really read old comics in the way I used to. People come up to me at a convention or something and they want to talk to me about old, cartooning from the 20s or 30s. And I kind of hate to break their heart and say, I'm not really paying that much attention to old stuff anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, if I was to say, like, who am I most excited by? Like today, it's the Canadian painter David Milne. I've been studying his work really carefully lately and reading a biography of him. He's at the top of my list at the moment, but the list changes all the time. I'd say that I've always been a real cultural sponge. And, if you talk to me next week, it would be somebody else.
Right. Okay. Is it fair to call your work Canadiana?
I think it's part of it. I would say that much like we were just talking about, like the old cartooning, I went through a very strong Canadian phase within the last 20 years. And it's funny how things come and go. If you talked to me like 15 years ago, I would have probably said to you that, well, it's funny, in the book Catcher in the Rye, there's a part where Holden Caulfield is friends with this fellow who's a Catholic, a Roman Catholic. And he says that even though they get along really well, he knows the guy would just like him better if he was a Catholic. And that's how I felt about Canadian stuff. I was like, I liked all kinds of art, but if it was Canadian, I just liked it better.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny, I've kind of like worked my way through that as well. Now I feel like I have to like gear myself up for Canadiana at the moment. I'm almost a little tired of Canada. I've been reading Mavis Gallant lately, who I never read that much of in the past. I find that her stories set in Canada are the ones I'm least interested in. I much prefer her ones where they're set in Paris or in Eastern Europe. And I think maybe it's just that, when you overdo it on certain things, it's kind of like eating too much of the same food. So I would say that my work is Canadian. It's about Canada, and it's deeply immersed in the Canadian experience. I mean, I can't draw anything that doesn't kind of look like it's taking place in Ontario, but I don't think about it as much anymore. Certainly, if in the last 20 years, though, I think I made a super conscious effort to make the work Canadian.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that. based on what you've just said, about your latest book, Palookaville 24. And maybe for those not familiar with the Palookaville series, maybe you could talk a bit about that and maybe your inspiration for it as well.
Yeah, Palookaville, it's funny. It's evolved over the years. Initially, I mean, I came up in the 80s and early 90s. And that was a period when, as an art cartoonist or an alternative cartoonist, whatever the hell the term is, you had your catch all comic book title. So you wanted to have something where you could do a series of works and you weren't tied down. So it wasn't going to be named for a character or anything. You would find some sort of a catch all name. For me, it was Palookaville. For like Dan Clowes, it was 8 Ball. Or for Chris Ware, it was the Acme Novelty Library. Something that would be an open enough umbrella that you could kind of do anything in it. And over the years, I did a series of graphic novels I serialized through Palookaville. But eventually, a point came where that market changed. The comic book floppy, as they call them, stopped selling. And the publisher of Drawn Quaterly came to me at one point and he said, would you consider transforming Palookaville from a comic into like a hardcover book? At first, I was kind of resistant because I had such a long love affair with the idea of the periodical comic book. But, as I thought about it, it made sense because I never really produced comics in the way that I loved. I mean, I put out a comic once every year or two. And so it doesn't make much sense, like to be in love with periodical comics when you're not really publishing them in a periodic way. So I thought, let's give it a try. And we put together the first hardcover. And I really ended up liking it better in the long run because I think it suits more what I do. As I've grown older, I produce a lot of work now that's kind of for no particular reason. I'm not going to put it in a gallery necessarily or publish it in a book. Palookaville offers me an opportunity to kind of showcase stuff that I'm doing here in the studio that might never get out into the world otherwise. So the book's really turned into kind of an esoteric anthology for me to just do whatever I want. So I have some sense of the readership and that I still want to give them something to read. So I do have like projects on the go, like I'm doing my memoir in there. Palookaville is usually broken down into 3 sections. And in this one, I have like the front section where I'm serializing a memoir of my life I'm doing in comics form. In the middle, I'm showcasing a little film I made about a puppet show with the director, Luke Chamberlain. And the third section is stuff from my sketchbook. Often stuff from my sketchbook ends up in Palookaville because it's stuff that nobody would ever see. I'm not doing it with the intention of publication, but it suits publishing well. I mean, it's works on paper. Often they're stories. In some ways, I guess if I were more contemporary type person, this would just be a blog. But for me, having it in a hardcover format, it's exciting. I love to put out a volume of something I can put on a shelf. I really love print.
Right. Well, I want to get back to one of those items that you have in the book besides your memoir, and it's the essay, The Apology of Albert Batch. I wonder if you could talk a wee bit about that.
Yeah, that's one of those projects I was talking about, which was, with no specific goal in mind. Many, many years ago, I got the idea I wanted to make a little puppet show. Mostly this was inspired by Alexander Calder's amazing circus that if you've ever seen it, is like a remarkable, playful work. It's, a kind of a little toy circus that Calder made back in the 20s and 30s. And he used to cart around and perform for people. It's marvelous. There's a short film of it. I'm sure it's on the internet. I saw this film. It very inspired me. And I thought I'd like to do something like that. And over the years, the project sort of waned. And, I work on it a bit, then I would like put it aside. And at some point, I think the project just died on the vine. This would be back in the late 90s. And then I met this filmmaker, Luke Chamberlain, who wanted to make a documentary for the National Film Board about me. And sometime during the process on this, we ended up talking about this little puppet film. And he got very interested in me doing it. And by agreeing to do it, I knew I would finally actually finish it. And so it kind of pushed me to make this thing and get it done, which I'm grateful. I'm grateful that happened because I think it never would have been finished. I don't think it's an important work that my life would have been, diminished if I hadn't done it, but I'm glad it got done. It's always a bit depressing to have a project that you just never finished. So getting Luke behind me and pushing me got me to make the props, make the puppets, write the play, get it done, and then Luke, with his filming, is the person who brought it to life. I mean, the funny thing was working on this, I really learned I am not a performer. The great thing about being a cartoonist and working in your studio is that this is a private experience. It's not like being a musician where you go out and you engage with people. I'm a very social person, but I've really learned over the decades that this is, the way I want to make work. In fact, as I get older, I start to think like if I could, if I had enough money, I'm not sure I would even bother to put anything out for the public anymore. It's the pleasure of making the work in the studio that is what it's all about for me. So, but I've got to make a living. I need an audience. So I continue to put work out. In the book, you will find a DVD of the film and a middle section where I show some of the production, the making of kind of the film itself. Again, it's something you're never going to actually see me perform in the real world because it only exists in film because of the fact that Luke was able to put it together. I could never be able to perform this in real life.
Right. And I guess maybe to summarize that, you don't know something until you try it. I guess you got to go through the motions.
That's for sure. I mean, I think when I was a younger person, I thought I would really enjoy the idea of performing something. Like I said, I'm not a shy person. I don't mind getting up on stage and giving a talk or doing an interview or any of these sort of things. But it's funny, just because you're able to do something doesn't mean you were meant to do it. And certainly working on this puppet thing really showed me I have no desire to perform.
Your book also includes 5 spontaneous stories, and you briefly mentioned that. I'm wondering, did you set this about as a challenge for yourself?
Yeah, I do that in my sketchbook where I think it's funny, it's hard to talk about this stuff in a way because you don't plan out how you're going to work as an artist. I mean, you think you will when you're young. When you start out, you think like you're going to produce a body of work and you kind of imagine what that body of work will be, and then you're just going to do it. But of course, that's not how it happens at all. You just end up doing a whole bunch of different things as an artist. And eventually you look back and you realize they're all connected somehow, that the work kind of creates you rather than you creating the work. After it's all done, you look back and you realize you've defined yourself through the work. And in the sketchbook, it's very much like that too. I don't have any kind of a plan on what I'm doing with the sketchbooks. I just ramble along, work on this, work on that. So with this specific thing, I got into a period where I started to write some lists down in my sketchbooks where I would pull out, like, say, an old phone book and write down like names of streets or people's names. Or in this case, I had some old nursery catalogs sitting around from the 50s and 60s. And I made a long 2-page list of the flower names, which were very evocative. They all had wonderful names like Golden Flame or like the Crimson Sunsets, whatever. When I finished the list, I thought to myself, these are really nice, evocative names. And I thought it would be an interesting challenge to just quickly pick 5 of these names and then force myself to write a story, and quickly write a story too, that came from the name itself. Something that would just evoke a narrative and then quickly churn it out onto the page. It was a real pleasure. I think that started me working on different kind of comics in my sketchbooks again. Because I go through phases in the sketchbooks. I'll just do drawings, or sometimes I'll set the book down for a year. I won't even touch them. But this got me doing some more comics, which is always, I think, ultimately what I feel is the most valuable for me to be doing on the side, is to do some kind of narrative work.
Right. Wanted to switch gears a wee bit. In a McLean's video interview almost 8 years ago, you mentioned your traditional tools that include Speedball ink and HB pencils. Want to know if that's still the case? Have your tools changed over the years? And maybe you can walk us through your creative workflow.
Yeah, my tools have changed over the years. They've actually kind of gone back to what I was mostly doing when I was a teenager, or using, I should say. Certainly in my 20s, that's when I was really studying classic cartooning and looking at the cartoonists I loved. So if I was looking at someone like, say, Peter Arno from The New Yorker, I was studying what kind of brushes would he be using? What are they doing here? How are they putting down ink washes? And I spent certainly a decade or two really, really trying to work with a brush to create a perfect kind of brush line that I loved. I went through using all the expensive sable brushes, but eventually I came down to just using very cheap synthetic brushes that would give me a good line. And when I didn't like them, I could just throw them in the garbage. So I would go through many brushes. And I was very, very concerned with this very slick kind of brush line that I was going for. And at some point, I got like, I would say, I started to feel like it was the master of me rather than I was the master of it. It would take me forever to do a comic page. I would get very, very anal about how the final artwork looked. And I would say I would spend 3 hours inking a page. I would spend 6 hours whiting it out, carefully picking at every little detail, getting it just right. I grew to hate the process. I mean, when I worked in the sketchbook with the brush, it was still pleasurable because I wasn't concerned with finish in the same way. So slowly over the last 10 years, I'd say I've been abandoning the tools that I spent so long learning to use. Most of the time, I'm just drawing with cheap magic markers now. And a lot of the color I'm putting down is with sort of those kindergarten blocks that you see children using of poster paint. Just mix them right on top of the block, just plop it down. These are the tools I was using when I was a teenager, really. A lot of my work is just drawn onto like cheap Xerox paper now, too. I feel like part of it is trying to get away from the preciousness of producing kind of perfect art, in quotes. I think that I spent many, many years trying to create or to achieve a kind of fetishistic finished product. I mean, I still do that for some stuff. Some things you just want it to be the best you can do. But a lot of the work now I'm trying to have a spontaneity to it. I'm trying to loosen it up. I think part of it is simply that I'm very aware that at 60 years old, how many more books do I have in me? And I want to get those books done. And they're not going to get done with the method that Clyde Fans got done, which took me 20 years to do. So I have to start working in a different way and much quicker. And I must say, I'm capturing some of the pleasure again back in the work by throwing out all that anal retentive worrying.
Yeah, you want to do something that you enjoy. I think that's one thing that I think everyone's learned in life as you go on in years. It's like, if you're not doing it for fun, why are you doing it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're going to be spending, almost your 90% of your life sitting down here, you want to take pleasure in it.
Right. Well, here's a question way out of left field. And I've been asking creators about the use of AI in comic book creation. So I wanted to get your take. Do you think that AI is helpful or harmful to comic book creation?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know. It's like if you talked to me when I was younger, I would just have a very clear screed against any kind of technological tools. Back in the 90s, I was such a strong Luddite, trying to avoid the computer and the internet at all costs. And like most people, I've been slowly dragged into the modern world. Or actually, not like most people. Most people leaped in, but I have been dragged in. I don't have a cell phone or anything, and I certainly don't draw on the computer. But I'm talking to you through a computer right now. I use a computer every day. I probably have the computers right here on my desk because I'm using Google Image all the time. It's an incredibly useful tool for drawing. But I don't draw on the computer. I don't use it for anything. And when you get down to AI, well, this is a funny thing. I didn't even know anything about this AI image creation until about maybe 8 months ago. I had a friend I was working with, and at the end of his emails, he would often include images. In one of the emails, there were these really great looking, what looked to me like vintage paperback covers from maybe the Soviet Union or Behind the Iron Curtain from the 50s. So I said, "What are these?" And he was like, "Oh, these are just computer generated images that I've been playing around with where I ask, the AI program to make me this or make me that." And I was amazed. I was like, the computer assembled these images because they were beautiful and perfectly done. They even had like the print quality of poor newsprint. And this really amazed me because they were great. And I've since seen other computer generated art that I've said, that's really great. So it can be done. Do I think it's a good tool for artists? I don't know. I mean, would I do a comic where I could ask the computer to make the images for me? Maybe. Doesn't blow my mind. I mean, everything changes so dramatically that it's hard to get a handle on what's good or bad. If you talk to an artist in like 1880 who was working with a woodcut artist to take his drawings so they could be reproduced, and talk to him about the new world that was coming of photogravure, where they could just photograph his pencils, that would be an enormous shift in how the work is done. We might be going through that process right now. Right now, this kind of drawing things onto paper, scanning them in, this might be like, the equivalent of a woodcut to artists in 40 years. It probably already is the equivalent to a woodcut to artists who are already working directly digitally that aren't wasting their time drawing things on paper and erasing and whiting out. So it seems inevitable that my opinion as a 60-year-old guy who has avoided all computer technology when it comes to my practice, that my opinion is going to look antiquated when the time comes. For myself, well, obviously, I don't think I want to read comic books that are put together by computers, but maybe I'm wrong. Again, like those paperback covers, maybe seeing is believing.
Okay, well said. Well said. Well, I appreciate your feedback on that. Well, before I let you go, though, I want to ask you what's next for you. You mentioned you're still working on your memoir. Is that something we can look forward to in the future?
Yeah, I'm going to keep plugging along on that. That falls into a slightly lower priority for me, in the sense that I will probably produce 40 or 60 pages of that every year, and then it'll be finished in, 5 years or 3 years, something like that. And then I'll gather it together into a book. The more pressing project for me in comics is I'm working on a new graphic novel now that's not being serialized in Palookaville. And for the first time, I kind of felt like I want this one to just come out as a complete finished book on its own. I'm about maybe a third of a way into it. As I talked about earlier, I'm using a different method of drawing it to make it more expedient. So I'm hoping to finish this book up in, 4 or 5 years and have it come out on its own. That's the big project for me right now. There's always 100 little things going on in the studio, but that's the one that the minute I can get a chance to get back to it, that's what I get back to.
Sounds good. Well, Seth, those are all the questions I have for you, but I'm wondering, is there something I didn't ask that you'd like to get across in this interview?
Good question. This is always the thing. It's like when people ask you, what your favorite movie is, you can never think of it at the time. But I guess the thing I'm always kind of thinking about when I, any kind of interview, what I guess I'd like to get across is that the sense of being an artist and how that has changed in my career, and the sense of what being a cartoonist is now. I have a very wonderful feeling when I see the work of young artists now that they have a freedom to produce comics in a way that didn't exist when I started out, and that's that they're starting already as artists. They're not starting as commercial artists. They're not starting as comic book artists. They're just coming right at it with a very pure kind of sense of producing art, and comics is just one of the mediums they can work in. They could have been a painter, they could have been a sculptor, they could be doing, digital art, whatever. But comics is there as a possibility. And for me, as much as I could complain about what's become of the comics medium, of, where it gone here or there, I am very genuinely optimistic of the future of comics when I see how young people deal with the medium.
Thanks to Seth for the chat. You can discover more about Seth online at drawnandquarterly.com/author/Seth. Thanks to you for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts. And please check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website. True North Country Comics is now on YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel and hit the notification button. You can follow along at True North Country Comics on most social media sites. Please send your feedback to John at TrueNorthCountryComics.com. And if you want to help the site and the podcast, please consider supporting the effort by chipping in at ko-fi.com/True North Country Comics. Your patronage is greatly appreciated. Thanks for listening. Come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2023.